We are doing poetry this week, chapter 6, and it's one of my favorite chapters because I've used poetry to teach with, not just in language arts, but I've used it in science lessons, I've used it in social studies lessons, I've even used it in math lessons. I'm going to be sharing some of those books with you all this week that we're going to be doing poetry. And like all the other chapters, this chapter starts with a poem, appropriately enough, and it is by Charles Gigna. It's really hard to say his name. And he's also known as Father Goose. He has even trademarked the name. And he lives, believe it or not, in a treehouse in Alabama. And he has written more than 5,000 poems and 100 award-winning books of children's poetry. He also has a really neat blog, and that's what it is. It's Father Goose Blog, if you ever want to look that up as well. But it begins on page 77 with a poem of his called What's a Poem? And it says, a whisper, a shout, thoughts turned inside out, a laugh, a sigh, an echo passing by, a rhythm, a rhyme, a moment caught in time, a moon, a star, a glimpse of who you are. I love Gigna. When we're talking about poetry for children, it is a great way of introducing figurative language to children, because figurative language can initially be very confusing to children, but when kept simple, it really helps introduce it. Poetry can very often have certain parts of it that are more meaningful to children actually than it is to us. They pick up some little nuance in poetry, some little rhythm in poetry that we don't always automatically do, and they tend to be drawn to it. More modern poetry, think Jacqueline Woodson, sometimes reflects some of the struggle of growing up in America today. There are some wonderful books out there. Some of those I'm going to be sharing with you too. But just remember that the figurative language, because of the way it's introduced in children's poetry, it is familiar to them because, as I've got here, it's based on experiences such as childhood. Look at this one, Firefly July. When I was 10, one summer night, the baby stars that leapt among the trees like dimes of light, I cupped and capped and kept. How many different forms of figurative language do you see in there? Well, just look at this. The baby stars that leapt. What is that? Well, it's personification. Among the trees like dimes of light. The trees like dimes of light. Simile. And then I cupped and capped and kept. Children are drawn to repeated sounds in poetry, but there you've got alliteration really at its best, and it's a cute little poem to share with kids. Lawrence P. Ryan, author of Sound and Sense, An Introduction to Poetry, which is a really good book for teachers to have, by the way, gives poetry a different definition than our textbook does. He says it is a kind of language that says more and says it more intensely than ordinary language. Think about that. A kind of language that says more and says it more intensely. Well, that is powerful. And sharing it with children can only help them with all of the goals of literacy even more. Look at this particular poem, Snowball. I made myself a snowball as perfect as could be. I thought I'd keep it as a pet and let it sleep with me. I made it some pajamas and a pillow for its head. Then last night it ran away, but first it wet the bed. I love Shel Silverstein. I'm going to be sharing some more of him with you. But if you don't think a kid would like that, you're wrong. Kids love that kind of stuff because they're going to pick up on that immediately. The emotional appeal of children's poetry. It really should reflect the real emotions of childhood, just like I've got here. Look at this particular poem, though. When you first look at it and it says Barefoot Boy, you might think, oh, this is a poem for kids. But sometimes you have to look. Before you start sharing it with kids, look at this one. Blessings on thee, little man, barefoot boy with cheek of tan, with thy turned-up pantaloons and thy merry whistle tunes, with thy red lip redder still, kissed by strawberries on the hill, with the sunshine on thy face, through the torn brim's jaunty grace, from my heart I give thee joy. I was once a barefoot boy. It's a beautiful poem, but it is Whittier reflecting upon an earlier time for himself. Of course, it's also written a little bit older language too, and kids aren't that drawn to adult sentimentality in poems. They don't really pick that up until much later. Poems that are about childhood or poems that teach a lesson, they're usually not liked that much by children either. But look at what I've got here. They do feel deep emotions from the poetry. Overall, children do prefer narrative poems that tell a story over lyric poems for the most part. Modern poems over classic. I'm going to kind of be showing you the difference whenever I bring in the books this week. They like limericks over haiku. I know a lot of teachers use haiku a lot with kids as a writing lesson, and that's not a bad thing, but limericks kids like even more, and you could be basically doing the same thing, because if you're following the pattern of a limerick, you're still having to count the syllables that you're using per line, and then they may even like the outcome a little bit better. If you will look at this one, kids love humorous poems, poems about animals. They love poems about enjoyable, familiar experiences, and they love things with a good rhythm. And if you look at this, think about the rhythm. Hello and goodbye. Hello and goodbye. Hello and goodbye. When I'm in a swing, swinging low and then high, goodbye to the ground, hello to the sky, hello to the rain, goodbye to the sun, then hello again, sun. When the rain is all done, in blows the winter, away the birds fly, goodbye and hello, hello and goodbye. Look at that. Just by saying hello and goodbye, can you feel the rhythm of the swing? Kids will pick up on that immediately. They are more likely to respond to rhythm in a poem as much or more than rhyme. I've got here where poetry begins, and think about this. A great way to introduce poetry to children is like jump rope rhymes or street rhymes, which is really considered more what we call verse instead of poetry. But a lot of you know these kinds of things, like how many candy in a dish, how many pieces do you wish? 1, 2, 3, 4. Kids pick up on that. There's a rhythm to it. Even little finger plays like I've got here. If you have heard this little piggy went to market, this little piggy stayed home, so forth and so on. That's where poetry begins for kids. They start hearing that and hearing that little rhythm at a very early age, and that's why that they respond to it well when it's being read to them in class. When we're talking about that with the elements of rhythm, children's preferences for poems are centered around sound patterns. They really are. And when we're talking about sound patterns, we're talking about rhyming too. They get the rhythm of a poem, they get the rhyme. For example, I'll even show you one. Think about this one. Who knows the rhythm to this song? Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? Who doesn't know that one? There's a particular rhythm to it, and rhyme as well, and kids respond to that. Look for the repetition of sounds whenever you're talking about poetry with kids. That even helps create the rhythm. On page 82, as a matter of fact, it talks a whole lot about sound patterns and rhyme and assonance, which are, like the repeating vowel sounds, alliteration, the repeating beginning consonant sounds, consonants, which is the repeating end of the word sound. It's real similar to alliteration, except for it focuses on the end, like beak, flake, choke. And then it talks about onomatopoeia as being sound patterns found in poetry. Just look at Mrs. Peck Pigeon. Mrs. Peck Pigeon is pecking for bread. Bob, bob, bob goes her little round head. Tame as a pussycat in the street. Step, step, step go her little red feet. With her little red feet and her little round head, Mrs. Peck Pigeon goes looking for bread. Absolute rhyme there, but there's also the alliteration there. There's some of the same ending sounds there. The bob, 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 the idea of pecking, different things like that kind of even ties into onomatopoeia. Whenever you're having to repeat that sound there, like Mrs. Peck Pigeon is pecking for bread, that adds to the rhythm of the poem. When we're talking about the elements of poetry, rhyme, and sound, think about that in terms of musical qualities. I've mentioned all of these different things like alliteration and assonance and consonants and onomatopoeia and so forth. Kids love to say things. Think about this. My puppy punched me in the eye. She sells seashells down by the seashore. They love to try those little tongue twisters and such, and that's poetry, and that's introducing poetry to them. More on that, onomatopoeia. They love onomatopoeia. They like the noise. Kids like the noise. Look at this one, camping. Crack, crack, the fire crackles under the stars. Sizzle, sizzle, the water sizzles above the fire. Crunch, crunch, the campers crunching on potato chips. Click, clack, click, clack. What kid wouldn't like to do that? And that is whenever I talk about something that is begging to be performed. Kids love to perform that kind of stuff. They love to be able to actually do the sounds. They actually like to march around or do the sounds or clap the sounds. It's just a part of learning through play, actually. When we're talking about rhyme and sound, the whole repetition thing, they always like that. It means something to them. Look at this particular poem. Let's throw sticks in the creek all day. Let's not do the things we planned. Let's watch sticks float away. Everyone will understand. Let's watch whirling water flow. Let's toss our sticks in over here. Let's feel breathing breezes blow. The creek is quick and cold and clear. Do you hear those repeating sounds? Breathing breezes blow. Creek is quick and cold and clear. It creates not just sound, but it creates rhythm there too. And this would be a fantastic repeated reading where you have them read it over and over again to get a little bit faster and a little bit faster. And that is an incredible aid to developing fluency for children in their reading. Um, Children are really intrigued by rhyme and sound. Whenever you're going through the regular PowerPoint of this and you get to this particular page, I wish you would stop and go listen to Ella Telephony, because there's a lot of made-up words there that, you know, we call it ridiculous words, but they are nonsense words. They're made-up words, but kids love to see them, and it's good work in getting them to like divide into syllables. It's good where you can get them to like take each syllable and sound it out to figure out what that great nonsense word is. And there is another one there that's actually read by the poet that I think you'll really, really like. But when you go back to thinking about the alliteration, assonance, repetition, different things like that, some of those things actually are going to be what we're going to be looking for, that you include in your Poetry in a Paper Bag assignment that we're going to be talking about this week as well. When we're talking about the elements of poetry, sometimes we're talking about imagery. More often than not, it's called sense imagery. The poets play with the five senses. Notice I've got here that poetry can't be a substitute for actual sensory experience, but a child does develop a concept of the texture of a poem, being able to think of the imagery in it in relation to real textures. When we're talking about imagery, I like this poem for an example. Look at this. The chilly weather settles into your bones. Those once green leaves turn red, yellow, orange, and brown. Crunch go the leaves beneath your feet. The birds fly in a victory V formation to where the sun rules the skies. The days of winter are lurking around, waiting to be free falling. There are imagery words as far as like colors and what you would see. Shapes is in the V. The sounds, the crunch, the chilly, making you think of how cold it would feel. It talks about things being beneath your feet. The kids know that they can feel things beneath their feet. That's kind of imagery at the best, and it's good imagery to talk to your students about. When we're talking about figurative language, we can also be talking about how much can be taught when it comes to things like similes and metaphors and personification. Pages 82 to 83 in your book talks a lot about that. As a matter of fact, on page 82 is one of my favorite poems that is a good metaphor kind of poem called The Night is a Big Black Cat. It goes, the night is a big black cat, the moon is her topaz eye, the stars are the mice she hunts at night in the field of the sultry sky. Every bit of that can be looked at as metaphor. And with a little bit of personification thrown in there too, if you think about it, if you really want to get technical. When we're talking about metaphors and similes, just like I mentioned at the very beginning of this, sometimes it's kind of confusing. Figurative language is kind of confusing for children, but when you're using poetry, it makes it so much easier. Metaphor examples here, like the snow is a white blanket. See that imagery there? You can talk about that being a metaphor because you're comparing the snow to a white blanket, but like the kids can almost feel the blanket and they can see the snow and so forth, and it starts to make things a little bit clearer to them. Life is a roller coaster. Time is money. My teacher is a dragon. They can picture that. And it makes metaphors much simpler for them. Simile examples: as American as apple pie, as big as an elephant, as blind as a bat, work like a dog, eat like a horse. All of those are really easy to teach the difference between metaphors and similes to children. Same thing with personification. Whenever you're going through with poetry, here are some examples, like lightning danced across the sky. Kids can see that, they can picture it, and they realize that a person dances. Lightning can't dance, but they're giving a person's characteristics to lightning. The wind howled in the night. Kids like that one. Rita heard the last piece of pie calling her name. My alarm clock yells at me every morning. Those are all really good examples of personification. Whenever you are working on examples of like simile poems, I like this one. If you were going to do an activity, for example, with your kids, and you said, we're going to try to write a poem with similes and metaphors in it. Mining for a poem would be a pretty good example for that. Look at this. Mining for a poem, pining to go home, to where the rhyme and meter make some sense. Well, look at that. Poem, pining to go home. Wouldn't that be personification right there? Digging for a clue for what my words should do, all safely bound within a picket fence. Searching for a rhyme is not a waste of time, and rhythm must be meter's closest friend. Together they go dancing, lethely prancing and romancing till the person comes to a till the poem comes to a satisfying end. That's a metaphor poem example. If you were going to be thinking of a simile poem example, think of it in terms of like this maybe. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are up above the world so high. What's the next line? Like a diamond in the sky. Another personification poem example. The sun just had a nasty day. I think they did today, as a matter of fact, that I'm making this video. The sun just had a nasty day, refused to smile or shine. It stayed behind the dark gray clouds, a mottled grim design. But shortly after dinner time, one ray poked through the gray, a spark of golden yellow warmth reminding us of day. If you want to please the sun, don't take this as a warning. If you're going to pierce the clouds, please do it in the morning. Sometimes whenever we're talking about poetry, before we go on to this, one of the other figurative languages that you might be using with kids could be even hyperbole. It's used for laughs, to make ridiculous, you know, like my stomach was a bottomless pit. There's one more type of figurative language that you would be using with kids. Whenever we're talking about poetry and we're talking about shape, there are a lot of different poems that you could do with kids out there that makes the shapes, like diamantes. Actually, once you've made them, become a diamond shape. If we're talking about concrete poems, they're actually done in the shape of what the poem is generally about. Page 86 talks a lot about examples of concrete poems, and here's two different ways to do it. For example, they've actually got the poem over here on the side where you've got pumpkins, and well, this is a pattern poem, of course. Hard, gooey, round, orange, bumpy, pie, jack-o'-lantern, and then at the bottom, festive. When you're doing different kinds of concrete poetry, that could be one of them, and still kind of be considered coming out in the form of a pumpkin. But over on the right, you'll see a little poem written about a jack-o'-lantern that was actually written in the shape of the jack-o'-lantern. Check out page 86 about Concrete Point. There's a really cute one there on SOS. The overall impact of poetry is this. Don't neglect it. Keep it in your curriculum. It's really important. It not only aids in just development of learning, or becoming familiar with all of that figurative language and everything. It also aids, like I said, in fluency with the rhythm of the poetry. The poems could, like I said, they beg to be performed. So a lot of the prosody could be included there, where the words go up, they go down, the voices go up, they go down, they get very blustery in parts, they're very quiet in parts. It's important to include it, even in those other areas that we'll be talking about this week. And because poetry that's what it's for. It elicits emotional responses. It increases sensitivity to an idea or mood. When we are talking about reading poetry and all of the different things that it can do to help you out with children, pages 86 to 88 has great information for reading poetry aloud. I really hope you'll take a look at that. When we're talking about differentiating between real poetry or mere verse, as I mentioned earlier, nursery songs like Rockabye Baby, jingles, those catchy repetition of sounds that we hear so often in commercials and so forth, those aren't really considered poetry, but notice I've got here that they can serve as a springboard into poetry. Mother Goose rhymes. Although they're short rhymes, they're considered verse. And the reason that they're considered verse is a Mother Goose rhyme, in like one stanza, it's over. Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. And it's over with. It gives instant gratification. It's short. It really is considered more what we call verse than poetry. A lot of people get them mixed up. It's not necessary that you have to get all into that with kids or anything. That's mainly for yours, or for your own information. There's also what we call novels in verse, that are novel-length books told through poetic language instead of prose. You've probably seen them before. My son loved a book when he was growing up called The Voyage of the Arctic Tern. And when you open it up, it looked like the whole thing was poetry, but it really wasn't. It was more or less free verse, but it completely novel length. It was like this thick. Told a beautiful story, but although it was written in verse form, we don't really consider that poetry. When we're talking about different types of poetry for children, please take a look at pages 84 to 86, because you're going to be doing examples of all these different types of poems whenever you create your poetry in a paper bag projects that we'll be talking about. There are a bunch of them mentioned, even more than what I've got here, telling exactly how each one is created. That'll help you out a lot whenever you're trying to come up with what exactly are examples of those kinds of poems in children's poetry. Plus, I'm going to be asking you to do one poem that is your own, that is an original, and you might want to pick one of these styles to make your original poem. I had one student last semester who created her whole poetry in a paper bag. Since we were in lockdown during that time, she basically created her whole poetry in a paper bag project around coronavirus. So she had a lot of her poems. She found a few of them online, but she made up most of her poems. She did perfect examples of them, but they were about coronavirus or the Rona or the vids or different things that she called it, how much she hated quarantine, so forth and so on, which is absolutely something that kids could identify with. When we're talking about kids' poetry preferences, again, there are a lot of examples of their poetry preferences in our textbook. Some really good poetry books toward the back, and there are some little insets that talk about award-winning children's poets. My favorite, well, I love Shel Silverstein, but I think my very favorite children's poet would have to be Jack Prelutsky, and he's one of them that I'm going to be sharing with you guys quite a bit. If you will look at page 88, where it talks about choral poetry and performance, it'll kind of go along with a little bit of everything that we've been talking about. It talks about how to share poems with children and so forth. So I really hope you'll take a look at it. There's a lot of really good poetry books out there for children, thousands of them. There's good poetry anthologies. If you get your hands on a good poetry anthology, that's like gold, because it'll have a lot of different poets in it to share with children. Pages 79 to 80 gives a lot of different types of poetry book. Pages 88 to 89 even discusses reading and writing in the classroom with poems and children, and it talks about using some of these wonderful books that are mentioned not just in this PowerPoint, but also in the chapter.